you can think of a spatial consciousness, there's a temporal consciousness of history in the sense that nation state is a certain space. So can we imagine, if I asked about a spatial consciousness, can we imagine then can we imagine a kind of history, Asian history, or at least a South Asian history, which will not be restrictive of the nation state. So that the spatial consciousness of the history expands to into a larger domain where we have kind of very interdependent cultures, interactions, so migrations.
Yes.
Where all will be taken into different considering different perspective.
Yes, yes. So, yes.
The South Asian identity, in global perspective.
Yeah.
In many places there is no Indian, Paki.
Yeah.
Generally we use South Asian, the term.
Yeah.
The possibility of a nation, South Asian kind of history.
Yes, yes. I have a good deal that I would like to say on this, but let me first begin with the observation you made and see whether we can think about it a little bit differently. You said that the nation state is a spatial concept. Why should we think of it as a spatial concept only? Why is it not a temporal concept? In fact, it is preeminently a temporal concept, more so than even a spatial concept. It's a temporal concept because the idea of a nation state, you can actually date the birth of the nation state. It's a Treaty of Westphalia. If you had to pinpoint the exact moment that the modern nation state was born, it's the Treaty of Westphalia. And the nation state is a modern way of configuring community. Right? It's a modern way of configuring community. Now I want to use that to just make this analytical point very clearly, and then I will come back to your question about, can we think of South Asian history or Asian history? Is that one way of breaking down the nation state? So forth and so on. Much of social science work, in fact you could argue all of it in some ways, is basically built on two fundamental concepts, and then we have to see how they can be read into each other, and that is time and space. Right? So when I teach my students about development, so I ask them, so let's say I give a map of the world to them, and I say identify those countries that you have learnt at school are underdeveloped or developing. Now it's not politically correct to call any place underdeveloped. So you have to call them developing countries, and then the countries that are developed, right? And so of course we know what it is. The developed countries are the US, UK, Western Europe, that kind of thing, right? So forth and so on. And then you get the developing countries. And so they are convinced because they draw that on the map. They say it's a spatial concept. No, actually development is a temporal concept. Because what is the concept of development? Concept of development is it's an ideology, for one thing, right? And it became enshrined in the post-World War II period in particular. There's a solid body of work on how the idea of development. And it's a temporal concept, obviously, because what does the ideology of development really refer to? It refers to the fact that you have a group of people. So imagine you were on this line, you were on this horizontal line, okay? And I'm an Indian, I'm here, and the American is over here. He has moved much further along. I'm going in a rickshaw, he's going in a super fast train. All right. So what is the idea of development? The idea of development is that I have to catch up with him. But there's one little problem. That little problem is that I'm assuming that the American or the Japanese sitting there is going to continue to sit there. He's going to go further ahead. He's going to go further ahead. Right? And so the easiest way of explaining it, but then we have to translate it into other terms, is that this person is always playing a catch-up game. But there's a more serious issue there, if we put it in a different language. The more serious issue, of course, has to do with the fact that as an Indian or as an African who's underdeveloped or developing, present is the Europeans' past. My future is the Europeans' present. Therefore, I don't even have a future. I was colonized, and even my future is hijacked. Even my future is hijacked because I'm simply reliving someone else's history. Now today, this afternoon, there was a paper, and a thought occurred to me because of a question that had been posed. But this paper had been read, and there was a Q&A. And this had to do with, I think Michael Clapper gave the paper, and he was talking about how these artists in the 19th century in the US were using industrialized modes of production now for works of art, but the subjects were very often pre-modern, folksy. So a family seated around a fireplace, looking cozy, maybe with a dog, and there's so forth and so on, right? So he was saying that there's a kind of a paradox there. Well, actually, you can take it much further, because European travelers who came to India in the 19th century, one of the main reasons they came, I would argue, was they were now trying to imagine a pre-industrial past which they could not see anymore in England. So you come to India. There's a displacement going on here. This is what they're really doing. So it's not even that they're necessarily intrinsically interested in India. They're actually trying to understand what their past might have looked like before the factory started belching smoke. What Blake got so furious about. Alright? So, this notion of space and time, we're going to have to think about how spatial categories get translated into, how temporal categories get translated into spatial categories, and spatial categories get translated into temporal categories. Alright? However, to go to the question that you had asked, South Asian history, you said. So the first question I would ask is, what is this category called South Asia? We're using it now, but I can assure you, this is a post-World War II category created by the American State Department. You find me a text for 1900, for example, that talks about something called South Asia. Right? Now this is not intrinsically a problem. It may be, because of course then we have to understand that the United States did not produce these categories in innocence. There was a project at work there, and the very first question you had asked also included something about naming, right? This whole craze we have now for renaming institutions or streets. So you remove the name of Aurangzeb and you put Abdul Kalam, right? The former president. So we remove the bad Muslim, put in the good Muslim. Because then even if you can say we didn't remove the Muslim altogether, we just put a better Muslim, there, right? A good Bhagavad Gita reading president of India. Delightful news for the Indian middle class, right? So there was a naming there too, because the known name got renamed. South Asia is a renaming. The Middle East is a renaming. I think you would agree that in India, we never called that part of the world the Middle East. This was West Asia for us. What becomes the Middle East? And one of the fundamental problems is how American categories hegemonize the world. And we just fall into it. Now in India, I'm increasingly seeing discussions in the Indian Express, the Hindu, they all use the Middle East. But this was not the category that because you see, it is not simply a matter of renaming. What has happened here? Let's look at that. It's a very interesting illustration of this problem. What's happened is some fundamental shifts in our way of thinking when we start talking about it as a Middle East as opposed to West Asia. When we say West Asia, we understand, and this speaks to the question you asked, we understand the kind of continuities and links that existed between India and this part of the world. And India and Iran have very long links. Very long links. The first Persian newspaper in the world was not published from Tehran or Shiraz or Isfahan. It was published from Calcutta by Ram Mohan Roy. There were more books published in Persian in India 200 years ago than in all of Iran. Right? Now, I'll come back to this point, but let me just add a related point. Because it ties in with a distinction that I was making between civilization and nation state. It's implicit in everything that I've said. See, last 20 years, you will recall there's been 15 years in particular, there's been a lot of discussion about, how should India hedge its bets when it comes to Iran. Because we know, for example, very recently, we know that the US has been putting the screws on everybody to apply sanctions. This goes back several years now. And some years ago, 6-7 years ago, India voted against Iran in one of these discussions that took place at the United Nations Atomic Agency or whatever it's called. Right? What India was doing was, it was thinking only in nation-state terms. Now, Iran was simply another nation-state, and India simply had to make some hard, well-calculated foreign policy decisions. That's how the hawks would like to do it. Right? But all of this overlooks the fact that we have a very different relationship to Iran as a civilization. Right? And you see, the minute someone like me says this, I know what all these foreign policy hawks in India and commentators will say. They'll say, oh, this is romantic, woolly-headed thinking. How does any of this matter? This doesn't earn you any cultural capital today. This is a tough, brutal world. You have to make hard decisions. Who cares whether more Persian books were published here or not? Who cares whether the first newspaper in Farsi was published here? Who cares whether the cuisine that we got or something, in North India? That would be their response, right? But we can see that this renaming, so when we say West Asia, it means something quite different. When we say Middle East, it's not simply that we have now accepted the dictates of American foreign policy and the way in which it orders the world. We'd also have to ask, what is it the middle of, by the way? Because there is a different anxiety there, which would take too long to really unravel why this is the Middle East. So it's the Middle East in part because there is a profound ambivalence about the Islamic world in the West. So that the religion shared features with obviously the Semitic faiths of Judaism and Christianity, but there was always this lurking suspicion that the Arab is much more like the Indian or the Oriental because he's lazy, he's got dirty habits, but somehow his religion is a Semitic religion, so now we're goddamn stuck here. What do we do? So that Middle East represents middle in many ways. But the minute we say Middle East, we're using their template to think about the world. Right? This is where it's changed. So now you can see, you can anticipate what my answer will be to your question, because your question really was, how do we think, can we get out of this by thinking about South Asian history? Or about diasporic history? Incidentally, that is the new trend now in histories, in history departments in countries like the US and in Europe. And that new trend is you do various kinds of transnational history. So you don't take the nation state as a unit, right? You take the Indian Ocean world. You take the Pacific Ocean world. You do take the transatlantic world. So if you do slavery now, you just don't do, slaves being sent from Africa to the US. You look at the role of England and France, which was considerable, by the way. The ports there were used, right? And you look at it as a complicated web of relations. The question is, does that necessarily get us out of the problem of thinking through the historical mode about the world? Right? Because I think you will surely agree, if I remind you of some of the precedents, that the idea of doing global history, for example, has been around for a long time. And I'm not just referring to Oswald Spengler or Arnold Toynbee or William H. McNee, to give three illustrations. Something called universal history, global history, world history. Right now I'm just going to use the term synonymously. There are some differences, but that's an academic matter which we don't need to get into at the moment. Something like that has been going on for 250 years easily in the West. And there it was dictated by a very different agenda. It was dictated by the Enlightenment impulse. And the Enlightenment impulse was, it is critical that we know something about everything. Everything can be known, everything can be mapped. And I think to give you an illustration, and perhaps after this we can move to a different kind of conversation about something else. I'll give you one illustration of this Enlightenment impulse and the relationship of history and how chilling it can be. So, about 15, 18 years ago, Ashik Nandi had come to visit me in Los Angeles. And one day we went to the Holocaust Museum in Los Angeles. Now when you go to the Holocaust Museum, and there are, incidentally, every major American city would have one, as would most major European cities. They follow a standard template. There can be some variations, but there's a standard template. The history of that would usually begin with something about Jews living in Europe 3-4 decades before the Holocaust. Very briefly, but then it really begins with the defeat of Germany in World War I. Defeat of Germany in World War I, the Weimar Republic, right? And then the rise to power of Hitler, the passage of anti-Semitic laws, right? And then after the passage of the anti-Semitic laws, the gradual evisceration of Jewish presence from public life. At this point, they're not being killed really, but they're just being driven out of professions. They're being driven out of the public sphere. They can't be doctors anymore, they can't be engineers, they can't be lawyers. We're talking about the mid-1930s. Strict anti-miscegenation laws, all of that. The Holocaust, standard Holocaust Museum will tell you all of that, and then it will take you to, obviously, what is called Kristallnacht, the night of the shattered crystal or glass, when there was an orchestrated violence against the Jews, and then shortly thereafter the beginning of World War I, and in the meantime, of course, the formation of the Nazi Party, and then gradually, of course, the Jews being moved out of the city, being put into ghettos, the foundation of the concentration camp, the extermination camp, all of that. That's the standard. Now, we walk through it, spend a couple of hours, then we come to the last exhibit. It was astounding. Because it appears that the Nazis had a plan. They had, of course, this idea of what's called the final solution. The idea was to wipe out every Jew that you could. That's been well documented. Every Holocaust museum will have a large display on that, and the consequences for the Jews and how many millions were killed, 6 million, so forth and so on. However, this last exhibit was really chilling because it seems that the Nazis had a plan. They had drawn up the blueprints that after they had wiped out every Jew they were going to build in Berlin the largest and most grand museum to Jewish history and culture. Okay, so then I think to myself, what is really happening here? What is happening here? I mean, they want to kill the Jews, exterminate them, wipe out their trace as living beings, but not their trace of their history. Why do they need that? Because you might think to yourself, it's absurd that, okay, morally incomprehensible the idea of the Holocaust, but within logos, within the realm of reason, it makes no sense that they would wipe out every Jew and then build a museum which documents Jewish history and culture. What Judaism is like, what are their rituals, what place they role, what role they played in, the life of Europe. Why would you do that? The reason you vote is because the exterminated Jews would be seen in the same way in which you view the dinosaurs who died. They are part of the fossil record. It's a fossil record. And they had this plan. And this is what is so staggering. You think to yourself, you need a particular kind of perversity to really comprehend the world in this fashion. But this is what the addiction to history does to a people. So you wipe out the Jews, but then you build the most beautiful museum about their history and culture.
The everyday xenophobic nations, the everyday xenophobic regimes,
yes.
They have such a desire of having some museum of the some minority or whatever. In that desire, they will also.
This is a particularly European way of thinking about the world. That's what I'm saying to you. It's a particularly European way of thinking about the world. So while you were gone, I was telling him, that the Nazis had this idea of the final solution, as you know, right? That they were going to exterminate every Jew. But they also had this plan that once they have executed their task, they were going to build a grand museum in Berlin, the seat of the Nazi regime, right? A grand museum which would be a testament to Jewish history, culture. And I said, this is extraordinarily bizarre in some ways. You can't live with the Jew around you, but you need their history because you need it in the same way in which you need to know about dinosaurs, as it were. That is that they are part of the fossil record of humanity. This is the Enlightenment impulse, that everything can be known, everything can be recorded and should be recorded. Right? So this is the nature of the problem.
I was also asking about South Asia, maybe even Russia, but Rabindranath Tagore had an Asian civilization.
Yes.
The larger space of Asian, that kind of history.
But I'm sympathetic to that. But I mean, and the paper I gave yesterday was something about that, right? It's about the possibilities of people who have been oppressed or marginalized, thinking about their future together, resuscitating the links that they had, because the memories of these links have disappeared. Most Indians by the late 1800s, early 1900s would have ceased to remember the kind of links we had with Africa, with Iran, with all these parts of the world, right? So I'm sympathetic to that, but Tagore, we have to understand, was never really thinking in nation-state terms. He was thinking civilizationally. And he wasn't thinking simply of forging together histories. The problem is that now, many of these people were doing it with very good intentions. So what has it become? Including people I know very well because they are colleagues in history around history departments in various universities. So you write a global history of Muslims and you look at, how, for example, the first mosque was put up in Kobe in Japan, or the first mosque came up in Cape Town. And what is it doing? It's giving you these histories of these interactions, and frankly, actually in the hands of I would argue many people, it makes them feel that they're doing something cosmopolitan, you know. But here, what happens is there's no political project. That's the problem. There's a kind of an innocence in how these histories are being written. It shows that, well, people have not always been xenophobic. Yes, that's good. All right. But does it seriously question the idea, for example, that the so-called pre-modern world was in fact in some ways much more cosmopolitan than the modern world? Are we willing to then advance certain kinds of arguments? That, I think, is much less clear from the kind of work that is being done today about these so-called interconnected histories, diasporic histories, transnational, so forth and so on.